Starting. There we go. So thank you very much for everybody who's joining us again here at ID24. Next up in our schedule, we had a slight rejiggle of the talks. Next up, we have Shwetank Dixit, who's the head of accessibility innovation at Barrier Break and a former colleague of mine when we worked at Opera together. And Shwetank is going to talk to us about accessible smart cities, the way forward. And as ever, if there's any questions or comments, please put them on Twitter on the ID24 hashtag. And without further ado, take it away, Shwetank.
Hello. Yeah, great to be here, and thank you for having me at ID24. It's really great to ideas and thoughts. So this talk is about accessible smart cities, and what I think is being done around the world, and as well as what should be the way forward. So let's start with a little bit about me. Let's just get this out of the way. Of accessibility, innovation, and research at Barrier Break. Apart from this, I'm also a member of a few W3C groups, in particular the AG working group, which is working on the next version of WCAG. Before this, as Patrick said, I used to work at Opera, where actually Patrick, as well as Henny, were at some point in time. In the developer relations team, I was also the PM of the extensions team over there for a while. Over here at Barrier Break, I'm doing stuff where I'm trying to take a look at how we can use technology to make the world a little bit more accessible. It is based in Mumbai. It's a pretty interesting company. It's very great because it's an enterprise, but it also has a social mission. What it does is, it does accessibility auditing and testing. It does a lot of training as well, of people with disabilities, and try to make sure that web accessibility is taken seriously. It was one of the pioneers of accessibility awareness in India. We're hiring quite a lot, and the percentage keeps varying a bit, but about 70 to 75% of our employees have a disability of some kind, which ties into the social mission that we have as well. Overall, it's a place where we're doing, or at least we're hoping to do, a lot of good for that particular part of the world. So let's get started. Before we do, though, a little bit about this talk and what it's supposed to be. About smart cities. And even though most of the stuff that I'll be talking about would be accessibility specific things, but not all of it would be accessibility specific things. Some of them will be a little bit more generic, a little bit more general as well. I'll be talking about mainstream implementations, but at the same time, since a lot of these things are a bit cutting edge, some of these things are a little bit more experimental in nature as well. So I'll be talking about things which are pilot projects, as well as things which I've identified as gaps, things which could be done better. Since I come from a part of the world which is a developing country, and since most of the stuff that I'll be talking about and most of the examples that I'll be talking about will be from developed countries, I'll chime in with the developing countries' perspective. So if we're going to take a look at what other countries are doing, and then we'll see, okay, how would this be relevant in a developing country's perspective as well? What is that this talk will not really be about code. There'll be some jargon and there'll be some terms that I'll mention, but we won't really be talking about code. It's going to be more about ideas and inspiration and seeing what we can do in the way forward. And let's start. So to a smart city, it's a very vague thing. The Indian government, they announced something called the Smart Cities Mission, in which they 20 cities across India, and they said they're going to make it into a smart city. So I said, okay, let's just go to their website and see what exactly do they mean by a smart city. And even on their website, they say they mention the fact and they acknowledge the fact that the term the smart city is a little bit of a vague term. It could mean different things to different people. Some people might see it as a purely municipal thing in which they just are obsessed with building codes and making sure that they're proper. Whereas some other person, like if you ask a person on the street what a smart city is, they might have a very Star Trek kind of a version of what the future might hold. The reality is somewhat in between. So research on what exactly are people doing when it comes to smart cities, the more I realized that I needed my own definition of what it actually means. And what I found was it works for me, which is basically cities which are improving urban living by applying clever use of modern technology. This kind of definition actually works quite well for pretty much all smart city initiatives that I'm seeing. And in fact, it actually works for cities, even in history. Like, for example, this is not really a new concept, smart cities. If you really think about it, throughout history, we've been employing technology in a clever way to improve urban living, right since 5,000 years ago. In the Indus Valley civilization, for example, we had, those were the first civilization to use modern, plumbing techniques and having flush toilets and stuff like that 5,000 years ago. So they were using the advanced technology, the cutting edge technology of that time to improve urban living. In 1882, we Street Station, which was the first modern, power plant in Manhattan, actually. And before this, we didn't really have electricity as such. And after this, whenever we want to talk about cities, electricity is just a thing which is taken for granted. So the cutting edge technologies which are improving today will just be taken for granted tomorrow, which means that we really need to get this right, because if we have inaccessible cutting edge technology today, that will be inaccessible technology which is taken for granted tomorrow, and then it's going to be really hard to change it. So going back to our definition, there are certain things which are kind of implicit in it. In technology, what do we mean? We mean things like networks. We mean sensors, application websites, modern engineering practices, as well as things like AI, machine learning, computer vision. And when it comes to urban living, what we really mean over there, one of the things which is implicit is accessibility. It really is. Why? Because of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. There are about a bunch of 17 goals over there. Goal number 11 has to do exclusively with cities. So make cities inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. There are a bunch of different goals over there. I won't mention all of them, but there are a few which need emphasis. First, it says, by 2030, provide access to safe, affordable, accessible, and sustainable transport systems for all. And the second says, by 2030, provide universal access to safe, inclusive, and accessible green and public spaces, in particular for women and children, older persons, and persons with disabilities. So as you can see over here, when it comes to cities and when it comes to making smart cities, the needs of people with disabilities has to be considered if you go by the United Nations. Very, very important. Smart cities will have a dramatic effect on the digital divide. It can either be a dramatically positive effect, dramatically negative effect. If you have an inaccessible smart city, it is significantly widen digital divide. If you have an accessible smart city, then you'll have a significantly narrowed digital divide. And World Enabled, they did a survey of about 250 people involved in smart cities. Of them said that smart cities are failing PWDs, or people with disabilities. Not just, it's not just that they're not optimal. They're failing people with disabilities. This is a big, big thing, because you have a city which is using technology in an inaccessible manner. Once it becomes mainstream, then that's it. It's very difficult to change it. So let's talk about the various aspects when it comes to smart cities technology. One of the first things that I want to talk about, and this is one of those general things, is network infrastructure. Talk about it is because this is the base for almost all modern smart cities. You need a good, decent, robust network infrastructure of a modern smart city nowadays. One, you need a proper fiber optic network, because if you don't have that, you cannot really have good communication, good ICT. You cannot really have good ICT over copper lines. You cannot have good ICT over dial-up or slow connections. You need faster connections. And you also need things on the mobile side, like 3G and LTE or 4G. So let's take an example which adopted fiber in a very, very big way and saw a lot of gains. So Sweden, when they rolled out their fiber implementation, they saw a clear link between fiber and socioeconomic development. The municipality council reduced their communication costs by 50%. But what was even more interesting was the fact that in depopulated areas, the number of firms was installed. Also, the property value of buildings which were connected with fiber increased. So you can see how just introducing fiber can make a difference to the local economy. And this is kind of like the basis of what we're talking about. A great fiber optic network can really make a big difference. I was recently in a city talking about smart cities with the local municipal corporation over there, and they're a city which is in a part of India which is a little bit disconnected from the mainland. They don't really have very great, because of the geography that they have, they don't really have that great road connectivity with the rest of the mainland, as well as train connectivity or rail connectivity. So one of the things that I talked to them was in telecommunications, and to invest more in infrastructure, because that can really bridge the gap. So when it comes to cities, there are various aspects that you have to consider. Health and safety, roads and traffic or navigation in general, facilities and services. You have airports, buses, railway stations, and we'll take a look at a few key aspects of all of them. Let's take a look at Montreal and what they're doing when it comes to navigation. Doing is they're using cameras and computer vision and machine learning to detect common things on the road, like detecting potholes and sick trees. That's great. But one thing that in particular that they're doing really well is an app called Otter, which is from McGill University. And what they try to do is, what they position the app as is neon signs for the blind. What it does is it aids visually impaired people to know what's around them. That's the whole point of the application. So how does it work? It uses data from Google Places, Foursquare, OpenStreetMap, 490 transportation agencies in Canada, and a few others. The person is supposed to open the app, walk around, and have their phone connected via bone conducting headphones. It provides ambient audio as visual cues, and it uses spatialized audio. So if a person is near a bar, and the bar is, say, in the front left, then it'll say bar, but the voice will seem like it's coming from the front left. You'll know instantly and instinctively to turn left. So this is actually really, really great. From a developing world perspective, this is something which really is interesting. Obviously, in the developing world, have a little bit more of a pothole problem than the developed world. So using cameras and machine learning and computer vision to detect potholes is actually pretty nice. But also using an app like Otter to give real-time status on closed roads, one-way traffic, construction work, that's going to be a godsend, because in the developing world especially, well, it's developing. You'll find, especially in cities like Gurugram in India, that just out of the blue, a road is closed because of construction or some accident or something else. Sometimes roads are just marked one way, and sometimes they're just one way for a certain amount of time, like, for example, between 5 and 7 p.m. But one thing that developed countries in general have is a lot of people, which means you can have a good amount of crowdsourcing, which can give updates in real time on which roads are closed, which roads are open, which roads are one way. So getting that kind of crowdsourced data in developing countries is going to be a little bit easier. Google Maps is doing really great work in India, especially where if you contribute to Google Maps and if you put in data on which establishment is where, then it also asks you which establishments are wheelchair accessible, which bathrooms are wheelchair accessible, which is really, really great. One more app, I'm not sure how to pronounce it. It's jaccede.com. Just said, I guess. Anyways, so this website is really, really great, especially for people in developed countries. Just put in the city you want to visit or city you are in, and you have a bunch of custom filters. You wanted to see the establishments in New York which had full wheelchair access. You can just select that from the filter, and it'll give you and list on the map have full wheelchair access. So this is really, really great. It has a lot of good information for cities like New York, London, or in cities like that which are which are a little bit developed. But when it comes to developing countries, right now the information isn't really that accurate. I entered Delhi, and over there I couldn't really find anything. So it kind of is hit and miss. But if you're in a Western developed country, it actually is pretty great. So you can just check that out. One more project which the University of Maryland is doing is called Project Sidewalk. Now, what they're doing is also something similar, in which they're using crowdsourced data, various accessible and inaccessible places inside the city. So let's see. So over here in Project Sidewalk, as you can see, you log in, and if you want to contribute, it opens up Google Maps. And over there, there's a short tutorial in which they kind of train you. And over there, you can see, the sidewalks or the curb stamps or whatever, curb ramps. You can kind of rate them. You can, first of all, identify that such and such thing is a accessibility related piece of infrastructure, and then you can rate what level of accessibility it is. So over time, they're actually getting a lot of labeled data by humans, and which they're using to train their machine learning algorithms as well. Portland, Oregon, which is doing something called Lyft, which is a paratransit service. It has some limitations. For example, you have to book your ride in advance. So if you want to go somewhere on a bus, then you have to book your ride. Then it'll come, and then you can, if your wheelchair is there, then you can just hop onto it. Chicago announced that they'll add 50 wheelchair accessible taxis to their fleet as well, which is great. At this point of time, I have to mention that when it comes to smart cities and when it comes to smart city technologies, it's just these small changes which come, from time to time, which makes a city smart. One single thing or one single swoop which will make a city smart. It's just these small things which add up a smart city. When it comes to transportation, is wheelchair accessible cars. So we've in the news we've talked about self-driving cars and things like that. But when it comes to wheelchair accessible cars, there's also work being done over there. One of the most high profile is Chariot Solo, where you can just go and it's a single person vehicle, which is powered by electric rather than gas. And it's one of the few vehicles which is wheelchair accessible, and which allows a person on a wheelchair to drive, which is passed by the U.S. Transport Department. When it comes to airports and making that smart, it's a little bit tricky. When it comes to wheelchair access, especially, most airports are a little bit better when it comes to that than many other buildings and establishments, simply because airports are designed for being ramp friendly because of many other factors as well. There's a lot of other things which trolleys which need to be catered to, which kind of lends itself to be better accessible to people with wheelchairs. But one of the things that I've seen, especially in India, but in general throughout the air traffic world, is the concept of silent airports. So in these silent airports, the trend is that basically that they won't really announce things on the PA system anymore. So if you really have to pay attention to your gate and onto the screen, which is doing the announcements and listing out the flights, there's a gate change. Once again, there are limited options to know about that. So in those cases, you really need to pay attention. Myself, because of this. So in those cases, it would be nice to have a way to get a push notification, or with a vibration alert saying that, okay, such and such thing has happened, your gate has changed, or it's time for boarding, or your plane is late, or something like this. When it comes to airport kiosks, sign language enhancement of important videos would also be important, especially in a country like India, in which there are multiple languages. So a person might not really be familiar with, especially if a person is hearing impaired, they might not be familiar with any kind of written language, but they might be familiar with sign language. This is especially the case in India. Buses and trains. Over here, this is something which has been mainstream in many European countries, especially. For example, in Oslo, you have a situation, or you have a infrastructure and a setup where you can get the information of where your bus is right now and at what time will it arrive to your bus stop. There's a site called router.no where you can go and actually do this. But once again, having push notifications and vibrations and allowing real-time information to arrive in the arrival time, that would be something which would be really, really great. One more thing that needs to be considered over here is kneeling buses, and we need to push the local transport departments to make sure that the buses is as much as possible, or as many as possible, and then expose that data as well, so that a person who is on a wheelchair, they might not really be interested in what's the next bus which is coming to the stop as much as they're interested in what's the next kneeling bus which is coming to their stop. That's also something which sometimes it becomes inaccessible. As you can see in the photo over here, in the background photo, turnstiles are wider than the others, and those are meant for people who are on wheelchairs or people who need extra assistance to go through. But oftentimes, especially in a time in which there's a lot of rush hour traffic, people who are able-bodied who can just go through the normal turnstiles, they end up using this, which means that the people who really need to use this, people who have wheelchairs, are the ones which sometimes need to wait a little bit extra, and that's bad. And it's a frequent point of frustration for many. The New York Times had a recent article on the subways and about it being wheelchair accessible or not, in which they said that the New York subway system has about 500 stations, but only about 22% of NYC subways are actually wheelchair accessible. Even of those 22% of stations, sometimes the elevators don't work, sometimes they're out of service, sometimes they're just not working. Even out of those 22% of the stations, many times they're not accessible, really. So these things need to be considered, and these things need to be taken in account. And these are the gaps that we're talking about. Now let's talk about telehealth and what Singapore is doing over there. Singapore identified a problem specific to their region and specific to their locality, which is that Singapore has an increasingly aging population, and studies show that heart failure hit Asians about 10 years earlier than Westerners, and Indians similarly have a similar risk. The thing is, with heart disease, it's difficult, it's costly, and it's time-consuming for older and disabled people to visit the hospital regularly. And with things like heart disease, it's a chronic lifestyle disease. Regular monitoring, it requires regular monitoring. It requires people to measure for example, and their weight, and it requires generally checking up on the person and making sure that they're eating healthy, they're exercising, and just doing these things can make a huge difference in longevity. So real-time advice and regular monitoring can make a huge difference. Philips actually did a telehealth pilot program in Singapore. What they did was they gave patients equipment with sensors to track the health status daily and post it to hospitals' database. Specialized equipment which the patient themselves used in their home to monitor their blood pressure, their weight, and their blood glucose levels, things like that. Information was posted daily to the hospital's database. That data was reviewed daily by a telehealth nurse. We used to check on them, and if there was any kind of irregularity, and if there was any kind of signs which pointed towards the need for a medical or a clinical intervention, they used to do that. And the result was that the number of people who were satisfied with their their health program increased quite a lot. The number of people who said that even after the pilot program ended, they would like to continue with this, that was once again quite a lot. But this was in general about health. One more interesting thing that Singapore is doing is with physical therapy. So they recently launched a pilot program in which, once again, they gave patients a tablet and sensors. And these were patients which are older patients or patients which needed physiotherapy. And the tablet had an app which monitors the exercises. The sensors were placed on the people's arms and their torsos. And the whole idea was basically that patients can perform in front of the tablet, which monitors what they're doing with the sensors. Sessions data was sent to the physiotherapist, which was back at the office. And the app also had elements of gamification. For example, if for example, needed, say, 10 repetitions of an exercise, then the closer you got to the 10 repetitions, the more encouragement the app provided. And if someone is not doing the exercise properly, then the sensor sense that. For example, if the angle of movement isn't correct, then they used to have audio cues saying that, okay, the angle is not appropriate. So this, once again, is the future of healthcare, where it doesn't completely eliminate the need for a hospital visit, but it makes sure that people do not need to go there all the time, which makes the hesitation a little bit less. From a developing country's perspective, once again, this would be a godsend if it's implemented properly in India and other developing countries. India, it's a huge country. There's a lot of pockets which are rural and semi-urban, for example, slums. Over there, sometimes you do not have access to a quality medical or healthcare facility for miles and miles and miles. Mobile technology has grown. It's meant that even if you don't have access to a healthcare facility, you most probably do have access to your mobile phone. And over there, you have mobile data. And over there, you can actually get good medical advice from a proper doctor using telehealth. It can greatly help in physiotherapy in certain cases as well. Even though India is a huge country with a lot of youth, but by the sheer size of it, there's a lot of people who are older as well. And there's a lot of people who need physical therapy. And over there, once again, can be compensated with telehealth. People who are hearing impaired, like India, where there's a lot of different languages and they may not be comfortable with a certain language, having sign language interpretation for people on live video calls can also really that it's been proven time and time and again that early detection of diseases as well as disabilities can prove to be extremely crucial. In a country like India, once again, where there's a problem of having physical access to a healthcare provider, but also the fact that in many rural, semi-urban areas and remote areas, a lot of superstition going on. There's still a lot of misinformation going on. Sometimes when it comes to adopting medical practices, they're not really as sophisticated. And sometimes you find that people might even harm themselves or others by which they think is going to help them, but it's not. So having a telehealth solution over there in which a proper medical professional can come to them, even if it's a remote area, even if it's an area where there's not a lot of education. India has one of the infant mortality rates, one of the most highest infant mortality rates In certain states in India, it's more than sub-Saharan Africa. So having a solution like this would be really crucial. Now let's talk about utilities. Till now, when it comes to utilities, it's basically been a billing only relationship, which means that you get your bill, you just pay it, and that's the only time you really interact with your utility provider, whether it's the gas provider or the electricity provider. But nowadays, you're seeing more and more the prevalence of smart meters. What you can do with smart meters is you can have your existing gas and electricity meters sometimes post data to a backend where you can see it. Existing meters, which are not smart, it's very difficult to sometimes see and track your consumption. So if a person is low vision, or if a person is blind, they cannot really make sense of what's happening on the meter. But if it's a smart meter, then data of what you're consuming can be posted on the back end, where you can just log in with your app or on a website, and you can see how much you're consuming in real time. It's on the back end, and since it's available through an app or a website, there are ways to make it accessible, which means people with low vision and people who are blind can really be granted access to it in a proper way. Efforts already underway in many countries can really save billions in costs every year. The RNIB, for example, has partnered to help make smart meters accessible in various parts of the UK, which is really great news. And in general, when it comes to smart utilities, there's a lot of stuff you can do. Monitoring. You also have analytics. So you could, in theory, see which appliance even, or which room is consuming more electricity than the other. You can, of course, make it accessible. Also a trend of the Internet of Things, where you can control your lights, your fans, even your taps using a mobile app, which is great. It's great not just for people with low vision and people who are blind, but also people with motor disabilities. So you don't really need to get up from where you are and go to the place where you need to switch off your light. You can just do that using your mobile app, which is great. Now, when it comes, there's a lot of barriers when it comes to smart cities. I'll just list a few. One is, of course, of infrastructure. As I said, you need a good fiber optic infrastructure in your city, or you need a good 4G or 3G rollout, which is robust. Then anything digital will not really work properly in the city. Sometimes there's also a lack of scope. If you talk to many local municipal people, people in the local municipal department, sometimes you'll see that they're just focused on one particular thing. They might be focused on, say, making buildings smart, and that's it. So, sometimes there's a lack of people who can think about the bigger picture and how things can each other. There's also an issue of policies and laws. So over there, we have to work with local politicians as well as local NGOs to make sure that marketing requirements or the local laws are actually making sure that people with disabilities are taken care of. And of course, there's a problem of awareness as well. When people are actually coming up with smart city solutions, we need to make sure that they are aware that when you're making things for the city, you need to include everyone. And of course, in the end, it's all about participation and leadership. There's no one person responsibility to make sure that your city that you're part of is accessible. Local municipal councils need to make sure it is, making the solutions for it. And as well as citizens and NGOs, they need to keep up the pressure to make sure that any solution which is being proposed for the city, it needs to include everyone. So with that, I think I'm I'm done. So thank you so much. And if there's any questions, I would like to answer.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Shwetank. Right, let's have a look over on the Twitters. I believe there was a question. Let me just dig it out. Yeah, there was a question from Priya asking, are there any established standards or guidelines which ensure accessibility and inclusion in smart cities?
There aren't any right now. And of course, when it comes to smart cities, it's really on the local level that you have to see. For example, I can say in India right now, then the way they define smart cities is somewhat vague, and it's a little bit more too much on the municipal level and more about building codes and things like that. So it's right now I can't think of any global recognized standard of smart cities and inclusion over there.
Yeah, which makes sense. I mean, it would likely be a combination, for digital things. There will be aspects of WCAG that apply, but if it's physical, there'll be different types of regulations.
Yeah, I mean, there are different regulations for individual things, like when it comes to building codes and accessibility over there. There are different guidelines. There's no overarching guideline for smart cities and accessibility in that.
Yeah, that makes sense. Right, let's have a look. I don't think there were any more questions. So I'll take the opportunity to say thank you very much, Shwetank, for taking the time to join us. And for everybody else who's on the stream, we're going to have about 18-minute break, and we're going to be back on the hour with more accessibility and inclusive design. Thank you very much, everybody, and I hope to see you later on.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.